Hello, and thank you for listening to the Keto Answers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and joining me this week is Jeff Nobbs. Jeff is a co-owner of paleo and keto-friendly restaurant called Kitava in San Francisco, and soon to launch Trish.io, which is a crazy nutrition tracking software. I've known Jeff for a long period of time, and his standards on nutrition are freakish, and I've begged him for the last couple months, got him on board with Perfect Keto, so he's helping out with a lot of stuff there. He is so focused on vegetable oils and this crusade of fixing people's health that we have conversations every night at dinner about the impacts and how little people know about why we have such a high use of vegetable oils, how amazingly bad they are for you, where they're found, how you can avoid them. This whole episode is about, I think, one of the most important things about a ketogenic diet that people don't realize, that after you cut out grains, sugars, all that stuff, carbohydrates, that's fantastic, but vegetable oils are probably the number one remaining thing for people on a ketogenic diet that they should remove, and we just don't know anything about it. So cover all that stuff, why palm oil can be done right, how the health benefits of that in other oils can be used. A lot of notes, a lot of note taking, a lot of fun facts in this one, so tune in and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. That being said, let's get into the show. All right, Jeff Nobbs. Thanks for being on the show, my friend.
My pleasure.
So we're in Thailand right now. We have a lot of story I'm sure we'll get into, but you recently joined the Perfect Keto team. We're here in retreat. We're here for 2 weeks, roughly. And every single place we go, everyone's been baffled by how you order food. So can you just kind of bring us through a sample session of when we're out ordering curries or stir fries or whatever at any of these Thai restaurants?
Yeah. So the first thing I do when I look at the menu is I have my eye on what types of oils they're using. And if they don't specify, I'll ask the waiter or waitress.
Which they never do.
Which, yeah, it's very rare. But my eyes light up when I see something on the menu that says everything cooked in coconut oil, for example. So I'll ask them, hey, by chance, could you cook with coconut oil? Could you cook with olive oil? And usually they give me a baffled look as well.
What kind? You're like,
confused look.
Yeah, so...
They're usually very proud to say that they cook everything in vegetable oil.
Right. As with most places.
Yep. Unfortunately.
And so I think a lot of the team, I mean, I've ranted about this stuff excessively, but people have not seen it as close. And I think it's opened up a lot of conversations that I wanted to bring on the podcast. And so what are the big things to get started, like that people usually don't know that affects them with food? So obviously we have things like grains and glutens that people are going to eliminate with a ketogenic diet, for example. What's left after that? I mean, we have sugar, people eliminate that, but I think there's a big one with vegetable oils that we just never talk about.
Totally agree. I think this is the biggest contributor to health or lack thereof that people don't talk about. And like you said, we know that excess grains, at least your listeners probably do, we know that excess grains are not something that you should eat. Yet the traditional food pyramid puts an abundance of grains as the foundation of a healthy diet. And that same agency says that you should replace all of your saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. And can you trust that? I don't think so. I think that that's the wrong approach. And just to kind of take a step back, what are vegetable oils? When we say vegetable oil or high polyunsaturated fat oil, what are we talking about? So a vegetable oil is typically soybean oil, corn oil, seed oils. And if you look at your vegetable oil at home that you bought from the grocery store, 99% of the time, if you look at the ingredients list, there's one ingredient and it's soybean oil.
And this is more prevalent than canola oil?
Much more prevalent. Yeah. Soybean oil after palm oil actually is the number one vegetable oil in the world.
Palm is number one?
Palm is number one.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And we can talk more about palm. I have a lot of thoughts on that. But soybean oil is sort of the silent killer that's in most restaurants. Palm oil is used more in food manufacturing because of some of its properties. When you look at vegetable oil, most Americans get about 9% of their calories from omega-6 fat. And omega-6 is the inflammatory fatty acid that we want to avoid. That's why one of the reasons we avoid vegetable oils is because they are particularly high in omega-6 fats. 9% of fats from omega-6, that's about triple the safe levels. And most of that omega-6 is coming from vegetable oil. And a lot of it also comes from factory farm animals, which we can talk more about. Those unsafe levels of omega-6, that's causally linked to increased mortality, to cardiovascular disease, to cancer, obesity, mental illness, the list goes on.
So this is like, it's a very clear thing that you're very passionate about this stuff. And you're the guy who's the most strict about any place we go to ever, no matter where we travel to. Before we dive into all the ramifications of eating this stuff, what people should look out for, all the details, why are you so strict about this stuff? Like what puts you down this route of choosing which oils you should eat, which animals you should choose? Like, why is health so important to you in the first place?
That goes back a long ways. I've always been very interested in health ever since I was trying to gain weight for my high school football team over a decade ago. And
what position did you play?
I was a defensive back.
Nice.
Yeah. I wanted to be a defensive lineman, but I weighed about 120 pounds at 6'2", so it wasn't going to work out. And it worked. I gained weight. It was not a very healthy, sustainable way to gain weight, but I realized that what you eat actually determines how you look, how you feel, how you perform. It's who you are. And if you're literally what you eat, then you should probably be eating the best thing possible. But as sort of a perfectionist, it always really irked me that nobody could agree on what is the best thing possible to eat. So decided to take matters into my own hands and go figure it out on my own. And that led me down a really long path of trying to answer that question. But the three things I settled on were remove refined grains, and most grains probably, remove high fructose sugars, which is most sugars that we know of, and remove vegetable oils. And like you had said earlier, especially your audience, most people in this community know that we should be eating less refined grains, try to minimize gluten, grains that contain gluten. Most people know that we shouldn't be having high sugar diets, and that's pretty much universally true now. There are some communities that say it's not, but the overwhelming consensus is to remove high sugar foods. But no one's really talking about vegetable oils. And I think that's, if not more important, definitely as important as removing refined grains and removing sugars. And what I think is fascinating about vegetable oils is that it's a much easier sell. To tell someone to stop eating bread and pastries and cakes, that's really tough. It's a big part of our culture. It's a big part of how we bond with other people. Same thing goes for sugar. Sugar is delicious. It makes things taste really good. The substitutes are getting close, but sometimes there's still nothing quite like something that's made with sugar and flour. Vegetable oil, though, you don't even know whether you're eating vegetable oil. To replace vegetable oil is something that has a huge health benefit, is an easy sell because most people aren't even thinking about it, and affects the taste not in a negative way, but probably in a positive way, because you're replacing a rancid oil for something that's natural and much, much tastier.
Right.
And so we're unlike a lot of other things, we're trying to replace something that's toxic with just something that's neutral.
So let's get back to why it's so toxic. So this is the thing that I've ranted about for a long period of time. The podcast probably hit on food quality and why it's so important every single episode. And the easy thing for me to say is if it's a real food, eat it. If it's not, then don't. And I kind of harp on that. However, this is kind of like people don't understand the difference between vegetable oils and like how much they're being used. But before that, like how bad they are. And so three main things that people should avoid: grains, sugar, and vegetable oils. Pretty much you're going to have a ketogenic diet. You're going to remove two of those top things, but the vegetable oils are left over. Like you said before, the omega-6 ratio, people like hear this, the omega-3s are good, omega-6 is bad, and causes inflammation and all this different stuff. Should we chat about maybe a little bit of what very specific things, like why is vegetable oil bad from like the production standpoint, from the sourcing standpoint, the quality standpoint, and then how that affects your body before we talk about like prevalence and where people can find it and avoid it?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think you hit on a key point, which is for all the other benefits of a ketogenic diet, at the very least, you're cutting out 2 of the big 3 culprits.
Right. But what tends to happen is then people eat super high fat meals and then probably triple up on vegetable oils.
And so maybe it's a net neutral or even negative.
Right. And I think that people react to different things differently. And so maybe cutting out gluten for some people has a huge effect. And vegetable oils doesn't have as big of an effect. Or sometimes for people, cutting out vegetable oil would be the thing that helps their inflammation and then helps them with their plateau of fat loss, for example.
Right.
Like this is just one of the very big pillars of health that when you fix, a lot of other things kind of fall into place.
Absolutely. And it makes sense on a number of levels, which I'll talk about, including what the research is showing. So when I look at why is vegetable oil unhealthy, which for most of the world means why is soybean oil unhealthy, I look at it from 3 angles. One is the evolutionary precedent. We have never in the history of our species eaten this amount of vegetable oil, this amount of omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. It wouldn't have been possible. And this all started with partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil. Now more and more of it is soybean oil, but this whole sort of vegetable oil revolution started with Crisco about a century ago, when we were picking a lot of cotton and we had a lot of excess cotton seed. And some brilliant entrepreneurs decided that they were going to turn that cotton seed into an edible oil. And it was so cheap because we had so much cotton seed that it caught on and has just been growing since.
So some asshole just said, let's feed this to people. Like, might as well. I mean, was the first application food, or was it some other like lubrication or manufacturing, or what was the first application? Do you know?
I'm sure there were other applications. I'm not sure exactly. But I know turning it into food, and Crisco, it's like this bright white, disgusting trans fat. That was a very early application.
Yeah, interesting.
So evolutionary precedent, first time we've ever started eating at these levels was 100 years ago, and it's been growing ever since.
And so also to highlight, and I think that will maybe get you with soybean oil too, and a lot of these other industrial seed oils, is it's not like with coconut oil, for example. It's like you take a big thing or palm oil, whatever, you squeeze it out and you get some stuff. If you take a cotton seed and try to get enough oil to like make a tablespoon, or soybeans, like, are these things naturally oily? And how much do we need to do to get from cotton plant to a cup of Crisco?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, that's my next point. So I'm glad you brought it up, which is common sense. So I'll get to the research in a minute. But the second reason you shouldn't eat vegetable oil outside of evolutionary precedence is that just think about it from common sense perspective. Like you said, these items aren't inherently oily. Corn is not oily. Cotton seeds are not oily unless you have tons of them. So how many would you have to eat? This was actually something I wanted to figure out.
Fun fact time.
The healthy oils, coconut, avocado, palm, beef, ghee, butter, these things, when you think of them, they're fatty things. You could squeeze them with your hand and fat would come out. So to get the equivalent of the amount of oil used in... Okay, so we're in Thailand. We did a cooking class the other day, and I was appalled to discover that the typical small dish of curry has 6 tablespoons of oil in it. This is separate from the coconut cream or whatever that's used in the oil, or that's used in the dish. Same with pad thai, 6 tablespoons of, they were using coconut oil because it was a farm-to-table cooking class we were doing, but most restaurants are using vegetable oil. So let's just use that amount, 6 tablespoons, which is probably going to be some part of your dinner if you're having a curry. To get 6 tablespoons of soybean oil, you would need to eat 2,000 calories of straight soybeans. That is impossible to do. Unless
how many soybeans is that?
Oh, it's got to be thousands, hundreds. It's a lot of soybeans are small. They're dense. You can pack a lot into a cup. 2,000 calories is cups and cups of soybeans. That's just soybeans. Let's say you're at a Mexican food restaurant. most Mexican food restaurants are cooking in corn oil. Let's just use that same number of 6 tablespoons. To get the equivalent of 6 tablespoons of corn oil, you need to eat 75 ears of corn. This is not realistic.
It's absurd.
It's absolutely absurd. Rice bran oil, which some are now touting as the healthy alternative, you'd have to eat 12 cups of rice bran. That would never happen. I mean, you probably wouldn't make it through a few tablespoons of straight rice bran. But then when you look at the healthier oils, like an avocado, 2 or 3 avocados and you get 6 tablespoons of oil. Now, 2 or 3 avocados is still a lot. It's not 75 ears of corn. I can imagine eating 2 avocados, 3 avocados, no problem. It still kind of points to, though, 6 tablespoons of oil. Oil doesn't contain a ton of nutrition. That might be on the upper limit of how much we'd want to include in one meal, if not one day's worth of food. And we can talk more about how to get healthier fats and all that. And I know you've put a lot of great content out there. And I know you also don't advocate drenching all of your meals with oil because of its lack of nutrition. There are better ways to make your food delicious while adding fat.
Right. And I think that the propensity just to add fat in infinite amounts to food just because people are on a ketogenic diet and not limiting fat consumption, I think that that's kind of a faulty way to look at things. I don't think you need an excessive amount of fat for your diet. Completely different conversation. So not only does it just take a ridiculous amount of food to get to that point, but how are we taking corn and soy and cottonseed and rice bran and whatever the hell a canola is to create this amount of oil?
Yeah, this is one of those things where it's not always great to find out because it makes you cringe a little bit. Sort of like learning more about factory farm animals. But to get the oil out of something like corn, you need to use extremely high heat. So this is why you very rarely see cold pressed corn oil or cold pressed soybean oil. You see that all the time for olives because it's very easy. You just physically press it and the oil comes out. That doesn't work so well with something like corn, where an entire ear of corn contains just over a gram of fat. So you need to submit it to extremely high heat. You need to add harsh chemicals like hexane that still linger in the food, in the oil, when you're eating it. And this kind of ties back to more of the things we can talk about. But outside of just how you manufacture it, there's so much that goes into the process of actually getting that corn in the first place through monocrops, through the destruction to rainforest, to what the impact on climate change. There's all these upstream and downstream effects by having so much of our food revolve around corn and soy.
So we take it, we add chemicals, we add super high heat. Like what I don't think people realize, and we have a breakdown on canola oil on our website about this, but the amount of steps that are required to take a plant to an oil with vegetable oil is just insane. Like the amount of chemicals and the amount of stabilizers and everything like that versus just taking a press and pressing it, like you said, with olives, or like you guys did at the farm last week. Didn't you take coconuts and basically make coconut oil?
We did. So just to use that same example of 6 tablespoons of oil, that required only about a half a coconut. I can eat a half a coconut. Half a coconut's delicious. And I'm still kind of hungry afterwards. Right. And so, yeah, we scraped the coconut. We squeezed out all the cream in a bowl of water. And then we let that cream separate and we scooped out the oil. And it was very easy. It required my hands in a bowl of water. It didn't require extremely high heat. It didn't require harsh chemicals.
Yeah, complex manufacturing with really weird chemicals.
Right.
In the massive amounts of the actual thing. It's like, these are just things that humans should not technically have access to, but our skull meat allows us to be able to manufacture these wild extremes to be able to get things that we call food. Like, this is not food. Like, if you need to take that much of 75 ears of corn to make one curry and subject it to like 50 different steps that require massive amounts of manufacturing, that, I mean, yes, there's
common sense, right?
Yeah, there's up and downstream effects to this, but that's just not a normal thing.
Yeah, totally. And it makes so much sense to you and to me. And I hope we're helping to get the message across that this is not something you should be putting in your body. Vegetable oil is not something you should eat. It is brilliant branding on the part of whoever called it vegetable oil.
Right. Oh yeah, I should eat more vegetables. Right. My doctor tells me that.
Yeah, that makes sense. But we are not talking about kale, spinach, and chard extracts when we're talking about vegetable oil. Yeah. It's literally oil pressed from soybeans. That is the huge majority of vegetable oil. You mentioned canola. That's also brilliant branding. Canola is actually from something called a rapeseed, not a grape seed, a rapeseed. The branding behind rapeseed wasn't so strong. It was grown in Canada mainly. So they rebranded it as canola. And I mean, most of my life, I never thought twice about what a canola was.
Right.
but once you start digging into this stuff, it just becomes so obvious that they had to rename. You have to rename it so it doesn't sound toxic and awful. And you have to, again, submit it to extremely high heat and go through all this processing just to make something that is edible, but still toxic.
Right. And so obviously it wasn't evolutionary possible. We should be we use common sense on this stuff. I still think that like people need to understand though, like what the effects are on consuming this type of stuff, and like why is all the processing bad for you? Why are all the chemicals bad for you? Why is the rancidity bad for you? Why is the omega-6 bad for you? Like what are the main reasons of why we want to avoid this stuff? Just like how it'll affect their end game of results that they want with nutrition, and how it'll affect their body and their life.
Yeah. So I'll start with the biggest end game, which is staying alive. I think most people have a goal of not dying. And so when we look at what the research shows, there are studies that replace soybean oil or corn oil with something that's a lower omega-6 fat, and they have incredible results. So just as a couple examples here, I'm going to pull them up on my computer so I get the numbers right. So there's something called the Rose Corn Oil Trial. And in this trial, they took people who were either at risk for heart disease or they actually had heart disease and or were heart attack patients. And they put them into three groups. They put them into a control group where they kept animal fats and other fats the same. And then the second group was a group that consumed olive oil and restricted animal fats. And the third group was the group that they replaced all animal fats with corn oil. So group 1, a mix of oils, a lot of animal fats. Group 2, primarily olive oil. Group 3, primarily corn oil. And the death rate was 364% higher in the group eating corn oil than in the group eating animal and dairy fats. So you have a 364% higher chance of dying if you're getting most of your calories from something like corn oil.
How did that compare to the olive oil group?
The group eating animal and dairy fats was actually better off than the olive oil group.
Ah.
The olive oil group was still much better off than the corn oil group, though. Yeah, I mean, olive oil, very healthy oil, lots of polyphenols, antioxidants, low omega-6 ratio. But if you're eating 6 tablespoons, half a cup of olive oil in your spaghetti squash pasta or your zucchini zoodles or whatever they are, that's still a fair amount of omega-6. I don't think this is anything we need to stress about. Most of the research shows that if your omega-6 are coming from nuts or from olive oil or from fatty fish, there's not too much to be concerned about.
Yeah. Okay. That is very concerning. That's corn oil, for example. Do you have any other examples of studies that have controlled for the effect of vegetable oils?
Yeah. So like I was saying, vegetable oil pretty much synonymous with soybean oil. So there's a study that was done at, I can't remember the hospital. It was Boston's Children's Hospital. And they investigated babies that were born with short bowel syndrome. And so babies born with this condition need to be given nutrition intravenously and just directly to their blood. And for decades, we've been doing it with soybean oil. Obviously, there are fats and carbohydrates, there are carbohydrates and protein as well. And for the lipid part of it, they've been using soybean oil forever. And the death rate has been about 30% by age 4. So for babies born with this condition, about 30% die by age 4 when they're given this blend, including soybean oil. some forward-thinking doctors thought maybe it has to do with the type of lipid, the type of oil that's being fed. And so they replaced the soybean oil and substituted it with a fish oil-based formula for some of these babies. And the results were, according to one doctor, freaking amazing. And parents called it a miracle. And so the numbers were, for the 42 babies given fish oil, 3 died and 1 required a liver transplant. For the 49 given soybean oil, 12 died and 6 required a liver transplant. So in other words, the death or liver transplant rate was reduced from 37% with soybean oil to 9% with fish oil. I think that rate would have been even more improved if they had used a different fat. I still have some concerns about fish oil as a supplement versus fish oil directly from fresh fatty fish. Not to get into the weeds too much here, but omega-3 is also very inflammatory, but it's also very beneficial, and you should definitely be eating it. But if you there is too much of a good thing, and if you're having a lot of fish oil and omega-3, you have the same issues with inflammation.
Got it. Any more stats? Any more fun facts?
I think those are the fun facts for now on the vegetable oil front.
Okay, so we have some studies backing this stuff up. I'm sure there are countless other ones, but I guess some of the just high level mechanisms of what this stuff does. I think that there's so many different ways that this stuff can be inflammatory. Well, like you said, it's just from a raw perspective, it's not really a type of fat. Like a fat is a long chain of a molecule that in your body does a certain thing. And with protein, for example, if we eat it, it's very easy to break it down to certain amino acids, which are like little Lego building blocks. It's not as easy to do that with fats, and fats can kind of have a life of their own when they're in different shapes and different formats. And so when we say omega-6, omega-3, omega-9, things like that, these are just different types of different chains or different molecule types of fats that your body as a human body wants certain building blocks to do certain things. This is not how we should be. Like these are not the building blocks that humans need to use. These are very, very different. And this is, I think, part of the problem, that it just from a fundamental level are not things that we should be using for building blocks. And so if you want to build a house and you have the plans for a brick house and you have a bunch of straw or a bunch of sand, it's like, okay, well, I guess I can use part of this or like try to make it work, but it doesn't really work. And so one of the biggest things that when I first learned about it, I was kind of blown away, that I think I've mentioned a few times on the show, but the fact that your cells, every single cell is made primarily of a phospholipid bilayer. So that basically means your cells are lined with fat, lipids. And these are from different chains. They get put into the cell wall. Then your cell walls basically decide what goes in and out of the cell, how the cell functions. So if you think about your cell, it's kind of like a big beach ball. And you look at, okay, that beach ball should be nice and blown up, so that way all the stuff on the surface of the cell can, messages, nutrients, things can go in and out of the cell. And that is a very easy process. Well, what happens when you start incorporating inflammatory oils and things like that is that this big blown up beach ball starts to operate and look more like a crumpled up piece of paper. And so then you have receptors that are non-accessible, non-active. The cell wall is very brittle. The cell can die easier. The cell can be more dysfunctional. And that cell wall takes about 2 years to replace. 2 full years. I mean, I think this is kind of important stuff. Like, and this is where like people maybe go out to eat and they're not really concerned. Like, oh yeah, whatever. It's gonna be some vegetable oils. Like, it's not a big deal. But like, these things certainly add up. And this is just one of the mechanisms. There's direct pathways of activating inflammation. Like the rancidity, your body. I mean, we can go through the pathways all day long, but it is just a direct inflammatory response. I was talking to you earlier this week about maybe doing a trial to see like how fast this response time is. And like, if I did a week of saturated fat, tested it, and then a week of, a cup or 2 of vegetable oil a day and tested it, like how fast will my inflammation spike? So I don't know if you're sure about like how quick these markers would change or some of the other obvious pathways that people need to look at, but this is something like it's very important about how it affects your body on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And from the research I've seen, vegetable oil isn't one that takes decades to show up. I don't know if it takes days, weeks, or months, but it's fairly quick. Obviously, the lipids you consume play a huge role in building out your body, building that brick house, like you said. And if the mortar or the bricks are of compromised quality or not the optimal thing you should be eating, or something your body has never consumed in that quantity, you're not going to have a great house. We could talk all day about the issues with vegetable oils. I think of them as like firecrackers in your cells, firecrackers in your body. And we haven't even gotten into how most people consume vegetable oils, which is through the deep fryer at a restaurant.
Right.
I think that
before we move there, just like a general conversation of a lot of people don't even like, they hear inflammation, they know it's somewhat bad. Great. Inflammation will essentially just stop you from reaching any health goal you want. You're taking away your body's ability to use food as a raw material to get a job done, and using it as a thing that makes your body like divert all attention to fixing a problem. That's essentially what's going on. Not a really good thing, right?
Nope.
And so, instead of building the house, you're putting out a bunch of fires that are lit all around the house. And so good luck trying to be focused. Good luck trying to reverse diabetes or treat heart disease. Good luck trying to lose any fat. When your body has to focus all of its reserves on putting out fires, you can't proactively do anything and get anything done. Therefore, you're gonna die faster. You're not gonna reach any health goal that you want, no matter what that is. You're not gonna feel good. You're not gonna perform good. You're not gonna look good. Anything that you would want out of nutrition and why you'd be making a positive change would be diminished from this. Some people have immediate responses and some people do not. But it's one of these things where I know several people when they eat vegetable oil, and I think that because you have such a clean slate now that you can tell when you eat it. It's like the analogy I always use is you're driving down a freeway and you have a windshield that's covered with bugs, and one bug hits it, you're like, oh yeah, great, still driving, no problem. If you have a clean windshield and you're driving on the same highway and a giant bug hits your windshield, like, oh shit, I need to clean that off. I can see what
much more noticeable.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of times people come from a really awful point of view or a really awful perspective of what is baseline health, and they don't notice all these little things creeping up. And so when you clean that spick and span and everything looks good, and then you have some vegetable, you have some of this stuff, you go, oh shit, this is the cause. This is why I was feeling low energy. This is why I feel bloated. This is why I feel super inflammatory. This is why my joints hurt. This is why my mental fog is there. This is why I have acne. I think that those things are way more clear once you have a clean slate.
Yeah. And I, N of one here, but when I go out to a restaurant and either forget to ask or decide, it's a best friend's birthday and they don't have any other oils to cook with, and so I'm just going to go with it. I can literally feel my stomach being inflamed. After the meal, my stomach doesn't feel right and I can feel it pulsating. And I've pinpointed that to when I have these very high vegetable oil meals. It just doesn't sit right. And I'm at a pretty clean slate. This can be said for sleep. This can be said for food. If you already have a lot wrong, little extra things that are wrong don't have as big of an impact in terms of perception. If you're at 90% health and you get to 93% health, are you going to notice it? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe if you measured it extremely closely, you would, or if you're a professional athlete. But if you're at 3% health and you make a little change that gets you to 6, you just doubled your health. And that's going to be much, much more noticeable.
Right. So very importantly, we said one of the biggest 3 things that people need to focus on. I think that when people switch to this stuff and eat low carb and especially start ordering different on a menu, eating out, eating out is one of those things where you can ideally be eating really healthy and keto and eating real foods, but still be fucking everything up because you're eating vegetable oils. And this is the hidden thing. When you said that you went to the cooking class and it was basically a meal would have had a cup and a half to 2 cups of vegetable oil if you were eating it. I was like, oh shit. It was a good reminder for me that way more of this stuff are in meals when we're eating out than we realize.
Yeah. And this cooking class, we had, a little bit of curry. We had a pad thai. We had a larb salad, which is like a ground meat dish. And between everything we ate, it was probably around a cup of vegetable oil, which blows my mind. I thought that when I was eating out, I was maybe getting a couple tablespoons in my meal. That's how I cook at home. I'll throw in 2-3 tablespoons maybe for a big meal. But a cup, I mean, that is an overwhelmingly large amount of vegetable oil flowing into your system. And I think it was last year, for the first time ever, Americans are eating out more than they're cooking in. And when people cook in, maybe they use vegetable oil, maybe they use olive oil, maybe they're more forward thinking or using avocado or coconut. But when you're eating out, which is now the majority of meals, it's almost guaranteed that it's going to be vegetable oil.
99. Like, unless you see it in the menus of them calling it out very specifically. Like, I can think of one, like Picnic in Austin, for example. We only use avocado and coconut oil. Cool. Unless they call it out, they're using vegetable oil. I'll guarantee it.
Absolutely. And it is more expensive. It's more expensive to use avocado oil and macadamia nut oil and coconut oil, but you get what you pay for. And this is another reason I'm so fascinated and interested in vegetable oils, which is a strange niche that most people don't think about. But you make this substitution and it doesn't make the food any worse. The eater is not making a compromise. They're making a compromise on their health by having vegetable oil, but they're not making a compromise on taste by having a healthful oil.
Right. And this is one of those things like you remove a bagel or cake from somebody, you're like, oh man, I really like eating that. You remove sugar and like, oh fuck, that was a really tasty treat you just took away. You swap out avocado oil or coconut oil for vegetable oils. And if anything, the meal improves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it from a culinary perspective, I can't remember if we mentioned this earlier, but I'm one of the owners of a restaurant called Kitava in San Francisco, and which is one of the reasons I'm somewhat educated on a lot of this stuff. Is we did probably over a year of research to figure out not only what animals we were going to source, but also what oils we were going to cook with. And we believe that there's nothing inherently wrong with cooking food with fat. I think this has been a scare tactic to get people to stop eating a high-fat diet. And now, a lot of the governmental agencies that first put that out, reducing cholesterol, reducing fat, have backed down on it a little bit, reducing total fat. But we wanted to figure out what actually is the best oil to cook with. And this is a question I get a lot from friends. When I go on my vegetable oil rants, they say, okay, but if I want to, fry some dumplings at my house, what oil should I use? Because everyone says olive oil, isn't good for low heat. And some of these more, they call them exotic oils like avocado or coconut or macadamia nut oil, most people don't know about. So we decided that nothing wrong with cooking with fat. Fat makes food delicious. Nothing inherently wrong with deep frying, with cooking food in a lot of fat, because there isn't as much oil actually absorbed in deep fried food as people think. But even if a few tablespoons is not great if it's not good oil. But most restaurants, they deep fry in vegetable oil. Some will use canola oil, rice bran oil, things like that. The huge majority are frying in vegetable oil. And when you're frying at that high temperature, upwards of 400 degrees, the vegetable oil completely changes. It goes from something that's bad to something that's worse. That heat, it exceeds the smoke point of a lot of these vegetable oils, and it forms toxic aldehydes. It makes the vegetable oil go rancid. And even worse, most restaurants looking to save money actually never replace their cooking oil.
Yeah, you threw this up the other night, and I was just like baffled by this.
Yeah, so at Kitava, for example, we replace our palm oil once to twice a week, and I can talk more about why we ultimately decided on palm oil, because I think that is sort of a contentious topic for some people. Right. We change it out once or twice a week. Once it starts to look a little murky, not because it's gone rancid, but simply because there has been a lot of food that's gone in there, and some of the colors, I guess, not artificial colors, but the coloring from chicken breast or whatever will slowly seep out into the oil. We'll replace it. Most restaurants, as a way to save money, and because most customers don't care or ask about this, will simply continue to top off the deep fryer. So instead of emptying it once a week or once a month like some restaurants do, they'll just continue topping it off.
Just eternal toxic sludge.
Yes, exactly. Sort of like a sourdough starter where you're always using a little bit of the last batch. Like a horrible version of that, where there's always a little bit of like years old vegetable oil that is beyond rancid and is something altogether different.
Yeah. Literally a toxic chemical.
Yeah. And this is why, not only for consumers and customers eating at restaurants, but there have been a lot of studies done in Southeast and East Asia where primarily women, are cooking with a lot of vegetable oil. And these women who are in their late 20s and early 30s and don't smoke have incredibly high rates of lung cancer. And they basically pinpointed it back to the amount of vegetable oil, steam, and smoke that's coming up in the kitchen that's being inhaled by the people cooking with it. And it's leading to cancer at extremely young ages.
If that's the case, if you cook with it and it's causing that, do you think you should be eating it and incorporating it into all of your cells?
Probably not.
Yeah, a good idea to avoid, huh?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think that one of the biggest things is just going back to where do people usually come in contact with it, and how can they probably try to avoid it. And I think that the biggest thing, again, like you said, fried stuff at places, like you're not going to be able to get substitutes for that. Like they're not going to change the deep fryer for your one meal.
Yeah.
And so maybe if you're out to eat, like everybody knows that fried food's not good in general. You think that there's not a bad, like if it's done right and if it's fried in palm or some of these other oils, that it's actually, it can be totally fine. So we're not saying like just generalize like, oh, just don't eat fried food. Like if you can do it the right way, do it that right way and it's not a big deal. But at a restaurant, they're not going to be doing it the right way unless they very explicitly state so. And so you can't really make that modification. So if you're out to eat, it's not like, hey, can you switch out your fryer for sustainable palm oil for me, please, for this one batch of chicken wings? Not going to work. But like we've been doing pretty much every single restaurant of like, hey, this curry, this stir fry, this thing, like, do you guys have this oil? Can you cook it in that? Places are generally confused, but more than happy to be able to do that for you. And this is not just Thai food. This is anything that you, like, if you go to a steakhouse, they'll probably coat the steak with canola oil.
Yep.
Even if it's a fatty steak. To
Absolutely.
get that sear. Like every single thing, everything that's cooked at a place, unless it's like dry, like completely dry, like raw vegetables, will probably touch vegetable oil at some point.
This is why vegetable oil is my arch nemesis.
Oh, it totally is.
With deep frying, yeah, you need to find a food that is deep fried that is either healthful or just not unhealthy. You have to find the overlap of foods that are not only deep fried in a healthy oil, which is very rare at restaurants, but also foods that aren't breaded, because most deep fried foods are breaded in something. And usually it's some combination of flours, usually refined white wheat flour.
Or flour and sugar.
Yeah.
And deep fried. So
Yeah.
like something good, like a deep fried donut or something like that.
I mean, that is, I think I was trying to think of what are the unhealthiest foods in the world. And it's probably something like a Panda Express orange chicken, which is deep fried in soybean oil. And the breading uses white flour and sugar, and it's using factory farm chicken. It's frozen and then re-deep fried.
And then coated in like a high fructose corn syrup sauce.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Yum. It smells great, though, when you're walking by. And donuts probably are right up there as well, because they have the big three of, actually, they have, not only are they made with white flour and obviously lots of sugar, but they actually use trans fats, which allows that fat to not melt when it's at room temperature, which is, a whole nother beast. And even worse than the typical soybean oil is a trans fat, which finally, the governmental agencies have come around. I think it was only a few years ago where they finally put out their official statement of don't eat trans fats. Trans fats are bad. This is stuff that scientists were saying in the 60s and 70s. We've known this for decades. So just because the official advice is that this particular food group is okay, that is far from universal truth.
Right. And
my guess would be that, I don't know whether it'll take 5 years or 20 years, but will the governmental agencies, whoever they are at that time, will come around to saying, hey, so looks like we had it wrong. Well, they probably won't say this. It'll probably just be snuck into the guidelines somewhere. And there won't be a limit on monounsaturated fats, but there will be a limit on high omega-6 fats.
Yeah. And like you said, we've known trans fats for 50, 60 years, and it's just starting to come out from the recommended agencies. Like we can't wait for the government to tell us what to do. Like we need to use common sense. A lot of times we need to use like very clear mechanisms of food science and how it works. We need to look at inflammation levels, look at some of these studies, and then just like make these easy switches and changes when they don't change. It's like also when you're at a restaurant and we switch even from vegetable oil to olive oil, it's not like they charge you more. Like there's the only downside you have is the short discomfort of asking for something different.
Yeah.
Maybe some confusion. That's it. Like you don't have to pay for it. It doesn't taste bad. Like there's no reason not to do it, in my opinion.
100%. I usually give a little bit of an extra tip because as a restaurant owner, I know that those special requests can just add a little bit of friction in the back of the kitchen. And I'm sure they would appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, there's no reason not to ask. And if you really want to get into it, like I do, you can carry around a little bottle of avocado oil with you and just ask them to cook with that.
Please just use this. So what are the top things that, obviously just asking for it, but like what are some easy things people can avoid at a restaurant that normally are coated or drenched in or use high amounts of vegetable oil? Is it just asking for it, or is it making better choices or different choices that are maybe not as intuitive?
Yeah. And speaking of restaurants, another thing that most people don't think about is salad dressing. You know, salad dressings have a couple of tablespoons usually of oil in them for the typical regular size salad. And 9 times out of 10, you know, unless you're going to a very high-end restaurant, that salad dressing is made of vegetable oil. So, you know, that's one thing that is definitely you have to be on the lookout for. Salad dressings, anything deep fried. We can't just say everyone should not eat deep fried food because, like we were talking about, there's nothing inherently wrong with cooking food in fat. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're out at a restaurant, you probably shouldn't order something deep fried. Probably breaded and it's probably deep fried in vegetable oil at an excessively high heat. Other things on the menu, anything cooked, really, anything cooked at a restaurant, especially if it's not a farm to table or organic or high class restaurant, is going to be cooked in vegetable oil. But for the most part, all of these things can be replaced by a healthier cooking oil. If you get something raw, if you get a tuna tartare, if you get things like this that don't have oil on them, then you're safe. But if you get pretty much anything else, not only is it cooked with vegetable oil, but it can also be replaced with a different oil. When you're looking at dips and sauces and marinades, these are the items that sometimes you just can't replace. They're pre-made. There's nothing the restaurant can do. And so in those cases, you can, you know, decide to take the hit and just eat it if you want. But I'd recommend that you look elsewhere on the menu.
So, okay, that's a good point. These modifications, I think, will go a long way. And I think there's a lot of companies doing a lot of work to make it easier at home with a lot of these products. Like Primal Kitchen has really good dressings that use avocado oil, things like that. Like, so there are definitely some options at home. I think it's when eating out that really, really gets people, and it adds up quicker than you think. Like you said, maybe cup and a half of vegetable oil when you eat out in one meal is just atrocious.
Yep, and it makes the food taste good, and it creates a nice mouthfeel. And in cooked food, it is just sort of absorbed by the food. So it's not like you're seeing a cup of vegetable oil in this, you know, this big meal you're eating, but it's there.
Right, and one of the questions that we have asked ourselves many times is essentially why? Like, why? How is this the case? And why don't they use better oils? I mean, it's just from a restaurant as you have one in San Francisco, it's all about economics. Like, if it's more expensive, why would they use it? If no one's asking for it, then why would they use it? And like, there's no difference for a restaurant to use it. So why would they do that? So even when you think a restaurant's like supposed to be healthy, a lot of the decisions come down to economics. Can I serve this meal profitably for this customer? And when vegetable oil is damn near free, like of course they're going to choose that versus something that's like 100 times the cost. Like when you guys were looking at stuff, did you price out the difference between the palm versus like peanut or soy or corn oil, and like what general restaurants usually have for this as an expense item versus like what you guys paid for it?
Yeah, and to be clear, we never even considered using these vegetable oils we're talking about, but out of curiosity, we priced them out just to know how much more we'd be paying. And some of these prices are I can't talk about because we received them on an exclusive basis from the manufacturers, but it's not, you know, we're not talking dozens of times more expensive, but ballpark soybean oil is 50, 60, 70 cents per pound. They do it on a per pound basis. And crappy palm oil is maybe a little bit more than that. And then when you get into things like olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, cold pressed organic extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, macadamia nut oil is very high. It's about twice that. Some of these are maybe $2, $2.50, $3 a pound.
So it's not that much. This actually surprises me. I thought it was going to be like 150 times more.
It's not that much. And they have quite a healthy margin on soybean oil because it's subsidized and they make it for so cheap. And I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but I'll come back to the original question. When you look at corn and soy monocrops that are being grown in the US, 90% is pressed for oil. And there are so many problems with these monocrops, the amount of land they take up, what they do to our climate, what they do to wild animals.
Just to pull it back a little bit and say, like, what is a monocrop? What does that mean?
Yeah. So monocrop is a crop where it is the only thing grown over and over and over again on the same soil on thousands of acres. And you'll see the big tractors going through the fields, harvesting these crops. And it's mostly corn, soy, and wheat. Those are the usual suspects.
This is one of the things that are is the bane of my existence. It's monocrops.
Yeah, I mean they get they're subsidized, and they give things like animal products an extremely bad rap because most meat that Americans eat is from a factory farm animal, and all factory farm animals are eating corn and soy. And so a lot of the vegan propaganda talks about the detrimental effects of eating animals, when most of those detrimental effects are actually from the corn and soy that factory farm animals eat.
Right.
Anyways, side tangent there. But to come full circle back to what we were talking about, 90% of soybeans are pressed for oil. It makes it very cheap. Those soybeans are subsidized.
So to talk about what the subsidy means for people who don't know exactly what that entails.
This is from a farm bill from about 100 years ago that has subsisted. And what farmers are currently receiving for their corn and soy, they would not make money on it if they weren't subsidized by the government from our tax dollars. So all of us health conscious eaters, people listening to this podcast, your tax dollars right now, at least part of them, are going towards subsidizing corn and soy and wheat. There aren't even close to those same subsidies for things like grass-fed cow, grass-fed beef, vegetables, fruits. All the good stuff doesn't get subsidized. All the bad stuff does. And this is more of a political discussion on why this happens and why we're growing so much corn and soy and how we're exporting it and how we want to make that cheap. But all that aside, if we weren't subsidizing corn and soy, it would literally be unprofitable for these corn and soy farmers to grow it.
Right. And the effects of monocrops on so many different areas is just baffling.
It's baffling.
You can only a lot of why food is unhealthy now, it is kind of two different reasons. One, we've taken plants from their wild counterparts and have bred them so selectively that they're sweeter and bigger and less nutrient dense. But more importantly, the soil in which we grow food, you are what you eat and you are what you ate, right? Mm-hmm. And so we know that from very obvious in a cow, we can say it makes sense, grass-fed cows, because cows shouldn't eat corn and soy products. They should be eating grass. That's what cows are meant to eat, right? But when we look at plants, we're not saying what did that plant eat? Of course, sunlight, that's part of it. But the soil is supposed to have tons of nutrients that the plant leaches up. And so when we have these huge monocrops, we get a very one-sided ecosystem that destroys the nutrition of the soil, that destroys the entire ecosystem of the soil, that basically makes that entire monocrop field useless and void of nutrients, unless then you pump all these weird chemicals in it and try to artificially correct that. That leads to erosion of topsoil. That leads to the soil not being able to actually sequester carbon from the environment. Doing this stuff and going down the route of producing 90% of soybeans for oil, actually makes global warming worse. That's a fact that people have no fucking idea, which is really drives me nuts.
Yeah, it's completely lost in the communication. And all the points you made are spot on. I mean, whatever diet you follow, vegan, paleo, keto, vegetarian, carnivore, whatever it is, I think we can all agree that we need fertile land and topsoil.
Right.
We need our soil to be nutrient dense. Otherwise, we aren't going to be able to grow anything on it. And soil needs to grow stuff. Whatever diet you follow, whatever you eat, it either grew in the ground or what it ate grew in the ground. And whether you're eating the plants directly or you're eating the cows that ate the plants, if they are completely nutrient dense, you will also be lacking nutrients. That means what you are, which is what you eat, lacks nutrients, and everything will suffer because of it.
Yeah. So
that's important. Yeah, that seems important. So full circle, restaurants use this really crappy oil because it's really cheap, because it's subsidized, because it's so abundant, because there aren't enough people pushing back on it, and not nearly enough people are demanding it. And so if like with the gluten-free craze, when people are going into restaurants asking for gluten-free over and over and over again, finally the restaurant owner says, you know what, let's make this item gluten-free, or let's have a gluten-free alternative, and it'll actually increase our sales. Let's say a restaurant swapped out their 50-cent a pound soybean oil for a $1.50 a pound palm oil. Does that help the bottom line? It might not. There might not be enough people out there. Probably aren't enough people asking about it, where tripling the cost of their oil, and one dish uses 6 tablespoons of oil, we're tripling the cost of their oil. It doesn't make financial sense. And so you're relying on the goodwill of the restaurant owner, which obviously you aren't going to have insight into. And that's why it's so prevalent.
Just real quick, we chat a little bit about the subsidies, everything like that, and like kind of how this whole system is set up. Do you have any information on, so obviously these crops are monocrop, but also very heavy in GMO. Are any of the problems with that passed through the oil production? And like, do we have any concern with that?
I do. So all of the issues that you have with soy, with corn, with rice bran, with peanuts, the plant toxins in these foods, which I know you've talked about before, and hundreds of ancestral health bloggers and a lot of books have been written about this. The reason that we're not eating wheat, soy, corn, the bran of grains and peanuts is because they have very problematic toxins. And for soybean oil and corn oil, rice bran oil, peanut oil, wheat germ oil, all those toxins are passed through. All of the downsides of eating GMO food is passed through. So you can't like burn that off or anything when you're pressing this oil at high heats. It's all still there.
And what about so GMO, I think there's 2 different problems that people don't realize. One, to make plants resilient, to spray a bunch of weird stuff on them. So that way it kills different things, insecticides, pesticides, things like that, herbicides to some degree. Also, it changes the actual, people don't realize that GMO is also changing the structure of the plant so that the plant produces toxic things that kill animals.
Right.
Which is just insane. Like, people don't realize this fact. Like, they make corn and make some of these things, like they insert genes into it that produce things that if a bug were to eat it, the bug would die.
Because its stomach bursts. That's how it dies.
Right. and so we're making plants that kill living things and then eat those plants.
It's when you really learn about it, you're like, oh my God, how could I ever eat this thing again? At least that's how I think. Yeah, the pesticides are meant to kill bugs. The GMO gene splicing that they do in these crops are also meant to kill bugs by bursting their stomachs open and actually destroying cells.
Yeah, I have a stomach.
I have a stomach as well. I also have legs and eyes and all these things that bugs also have. And it's, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to think that if something can be guaranteed lethal to a bug, that it could be problematic for us. And, there is an idea of hormesis and even something like a soybean oil or a pesticide having a hormetic effect, in that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and eating something in a small amount, might actually improve health. So like the old fable is the king who drinks a little bit of poison every night and continually has an extra drop every day. By the time he actually gets poisoned by a vial of poison, he's built up an immunity to it. And I actually think there is some truth to that. I think, this follows sort of a U-shaped curve where if you have a little bit of it, if you have none of it, I should say, this follows a check mark, sort of a check mark, like a Nike swoosh curve. So if you have a very little bit of it, you have, let's say, 10% chance of this bad thing. If you have just a little bit of it, not zero, but a little bit, your chance of that bad thing maybe goes down to like 8%. But then as you have a lot of it, it goes up to like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%. So I think there is a truth to what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But I think the issue is the amount matters. So to have 1 tablespoon of rancid soybean oil a month, a quarter, I think that's actually probably a healthier option than having 0. Is that at all realistic? You don't even have, you can try to be the healthiest person on the planet, and you're probably going to have 1 tablespoon of soybean oil a month.
What I don't want people to think here is that, like, Jeff said that we should get a hormetic effect. Therefore, like, I should plan out my vegetable oil consumption. It's like, we can also get this through a lot of different things, like exercise and like bitter vegetables and things like that. Like, there are certain ways to do that, but like, I think that what you mean is like, don't freak out about it if it's in very small amounts, but that argument doesn't hold up at the scale of which most people are consuming these things.
Yeah, that argument does not hold up it does not justify going out to eat food at a restaurant once a week and not worrying about what oil they cook it in. That is far past the hormetic effect. For someone like you, Anthony, for me, where we're very dialed in on our nutrition, and every few months we have a birthday party and have a slice of cake, or a couple times a year there's a wedding we're at and we can't get them to change the oil. That's sort of the level we're talking. We're not at all talking a regular basis.
Yeah. And if that's a case where 100 out of 100 meals, you're stressing out that if you need perfect oils, and that creates actually a baseline level of social stress for you, that might have a negative effect on your health overall.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think
control what you can control and do what you can do, and then like make the best decisions for you. But other than that, like, realize that this is the world we live in. You can't control every single factor. Make the best decision. Like, sometimes you need to fast. That's cool, but sometimes it's also okay and won't kill you. But just like being aware of this stuff, I think, is the big thing that people have no awareness on. Is like the magnitude of inclusion of these oils, why they're there, how you can adjust for them. There's just so much on this topic.
Yeah. And, we were talking about GMO, and I think who was it? I think Jimmy Kimmel did a segment where he went out and asked the average person at a farmer's market or something, do you eat GMO? And most people said, I try to stay away from GMO. He did this for gluten-free as well. And he kind of put him on the spot and said, why? What does that mean to you to stop eating GMO? And everyone kind of, no one has a good answer. Not everyone has a PhD in molecular biology and can describe what's going on inside your body. But I think an easy way to think of it is just evolutionary precedent. And like we said before, we have never eaten vegetable oils, high omega-6 polyunsaturated fats at this level. And I even hear scientists talking about how, this is okay because we've been doing genetic modification for thousands of years. How do you think we got the modern apples? It was genetic modification. There's a huge difference between natural selective breeding, breeding the juiciest apple with another juicy apple so that their offspring are even juicier apples, and doing that over the course of hundreds of years, versus gene splicing to create wheat that destroys life cells and bugs. Those are very different things. So when you hear the argument that genetic modification is fine because we've been doing it for thousands of years, you can pretty much immediately discard the rest of what that person says, because they're making a blanket statement that does not apply to selective natural breeding. The same way we got dogs from wolves, that process, I don't see any issues with that.
Right.
The process of like actually in a lab going in and splicing genes to create a desired outcome, I think that should be questioned.
Well, I think it's less concerning. I think that we still, that's why we have like a Cavendish banana right now that has a ridiculous amount of fructose in it, and apples that you've done a nutrient analysis on that are essentially void of nutrition. Like, it's not favorable to breed towards people's mouth pleasure, but at the same time, like, the GMO stuff's scary. And also the fact that a lot of scientists and people go, well, there's no research that says it's bad, so it's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also a giant problem. Like,
right.
I would err on the side of not having plants manufactured to kill living things be in my body. But I don't really want to wait for that research to come out to clear that stuff. We also thought smoking was not a big deal for a very long period of time.
Yeah. And what do we think of it now? And I think that we live in a very unnatural world right now. I think a lot of people probably go months on end without actually touching the earth with their body. They might go on a hike, but they're wearing hiking shoes. Unless you live on the beach and are going to the beach. Like we are so surrounded by technology. We are so unaligned with how we evolved to be as humans that I do think there's a case for sometimes unnatural solutions for unnatural problems. And these solutions probably, in hunter-gatherer days wouldn't be applicable because we were living in a very natural time. But, we're doing this podcast in a hotel room 20 floors up looking at an urban jungle, and we have technology all around us. I mean, I just looking around, I see 15, 20 different pieces of technology. Anyways, all this goes to say, I'm not inherently opposed to the idea of genetic modification. I think it can have some awesome applications. I think there are probably better alternatives, eating real whole foods diets, things like that. But the reality is there's billions of people in the world that are starving, that are extremely severely malnourished. And like golden rice, for example, something that people are eating anyways, and we can add vitamin A to it to fix a huge issue. I think something like that is worth exploring. Mm-hmm. I think if there's a way to make foods we already eat more nutritious, it's not that we genetically modified salt, because salt is naturally GMO free, but it's the equivalent of adding iodine to salt. No brainer, fixes a huge issue. And if there are any detriments, the benefits probably outweigh it. And so one example of this that I think is really interesting is there's a company called Thrive. I know you know this company, that not Thrive Market, but company that makes algae oil. And this is a promising way, I think, to create a low-cost product that checks all the boxes of a healthy oil. But to create this algae oil, they genetically modify algae that can convert sugar into a high monounsaturated fat oil. So it has a very ideal fatty acid profile, but it does have genetic modification to get there. So overall, what does that mean? I would personally still rather have organic extra virgin olive oil that's cold pressed, and coconut oil and animal fats and avocado oil. But if we're looking at a low cost way to replace vegetable oil, we don't need to create something that is healthy. We need to create something that is not nearly as awfully toxic. And so I'm really interested in that space of using technology to create a cheaper but also healthier solution to something like a vegetable oil.
Right. And we've talked about like what would truly be the ramifications on like the world in general if we were to replace all vegetable oil with algae oil, for example.
I think that would be very interesting, probably very difficult to find out. But, like we keep hammering, what are the ramifications on, let's say, if white flour was removed from the world? We'd probably have a lot of really pissed off people that miss their pastries.
Right.
Same goes for sugar. I think no one would care if vegetable oil was replaced with a similarly odorless, tasteless, but healthier oil.
Yeah. No one's has their pitchfork ready when you're trying to take away their vegetable oil.
Right.
Like, I've never seen that happen.
Yeah.
There's no, other than like large corporations, it's a $100 billion industry. Maybe some big wigs in some suits would be upset. But other than that, no consumer is going to be like, no, like I hear this a lot, like with keto of like, oh, I'm X or Y or Z culture. I could never be without rice or beans or whatever. It's like, no one's ever like, oh, yeah, I grew up with vegetable oil. There's no way you could take that from me. Like, I just need my vegetable oils.
I just need my Crisco and Wesson and my vegetable oils. Yeah, you don't hear that very often.
So I think that there's a lot in the algae oil conversation. I think there's a lot in like food and creating food. But before we get to that point, one of the things I posted on Instagram the other day was that there's a lot of palm oil here. There's a lot of coconut oil here. People cook with that. And I got a couple comments about, oh, I thought palm oil was bad. Like, you should never use palm oil. It's inflammatory. It's not sustainable. It's terrible for the environment. Palm's dangerous. Palm's awful. So please.
Yeah, this is definitely worth talking about because when Kitava, our restaurant in San Francisco, when we posted about using sustainable palm oil, we don't have millions of followers on our Facebook page, but we got hundreds and hundreds of comments on this one post of people just lashing out and going back and forth and arguing in the comments about palm oil. And it's a contentious topic because most of the world's vegetable oil is palm. It's about 30% palm. The majority of the rest is soy. And so how we manufacture palm plays a huge impact on a lot of different areas. So just to call out a few here. Sustainable palm oil is a totally different beast than unsustainable palm oil. Similar to how factory farm animals are very different than pasture-raised animals, especially when it comes to ruminants like beef. So let's talk about unsustainable palm oil. Because we're doing a long podcast about vegetable oils, I think it's obvious that we're both very interested in this topic. And I've been to Borneo in Malaysia, Malaysian Borneo, and saw firsthand the orangutans living in the wild and the impact that palm farms can have on them. I've also been to Ecuador and looked at a palm plantation and a community of farmers that are doing it right. So I want to talk about both. So let's start with the unsustainable side. Why are there so many issues with palm oil in the traditional sense? Why do people complain about this? There are a few things here. For one, there are huge areas of land being cleared for the production of palm oil plantations. And again, this is mostly in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, and it's pushing a lot of species to extinction. So the ones you hear about most are orangutans and Sumatran tigers. Orangutans have sort of become the icon of deforestation in Southeast Asia, but actually a third of mammals in Indonesia are considered to be critically endangered. So nutrition aside, talking about vegetable oils, palm oil in an unsustainable way has a huge ethical impact. Another point is that the working conditions for farmers are horrendous, and that industry has been linked to all sorts of human rights violations, which I've been learning a lot about. That deforestation, clearing out land to actually grow these palm plantations, has a huge impact on climate change. Burning hundreds and hundreds of hectares or acres of forest, not good for the climate. And last point here is the conventional growing methods for palm use chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. Like we were saying before, all of that depletes the soil. So who knows what, if anything, can grow on that soil afterwards. So that's unsustainable palm. The big issue, the news headlines you hear, though, are that it's threatening orangutan populations, but that's just one piece of the problem.
Yeah. And sustainable.
So that's the bad side. On the good side, palm has an awesome fatty acid profile.
So, okay, before we get there, is there a difference from a nutritional standpoint from unsustainable and sustainable palm?
If there is, it's probably subtle. Okay. From a micronutrient perspective, if you're having red palm oil, which is the unrefined crude palm oil, that's one of the richest sources of vitamin E on the planet. It can be kind of difficult to cook with because it leaves everything red, like cooking with turmeric does yellow. But if you're looking at, oil in general lacks micronutrients, right? So,
but is the fatty acid profile, like, do they process it more, or is it pretty much they press it out the same way? Like, is the manufacturing process different? Manufacturing process is similar. Okay. Yeah. And so it's just kind of a crude press, like a cold press type of thing, or how is that done?
I have a blog post all about the process for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, we'll link to it in the show notes for sure.
But yeah, it's fairly similar from unsustainable palm to palm oil. The whole process is very different, but starting with palm and then having the finished product of oil is a fairly similar process. And palm is one of those, like avocado and coconut and olive, that fit into you squeeze it and oil comes out. And on that blog post, if it's in the show notes, I have photos with the raw palm fruit, because most people don't know, like, what is palm oil? Do they take a whole tree and squeeze it? Mm-hmm. No, there's these red palm fruits that are in the tree that they hack down and use. If there are pesticides used on the palm, things like that are going to come through in the oil. But from an actual micronutrient perspective, there's no difference.
But no, like, stability of fat or like omega-3/6 profile or anything like that.
Not that I know of.
Okay, interesting. Like, no extra use of solvents or processing aids.
I actually don't know what exactly. So for the palm oil we use, the sustainable palm we use, it's all organic, start to finish, and I can talk about more about what that means. But I don't know how that affects the actual processing of it.
And then before I lose this train of thought as well, that 30% of palm oil that's worldwide vegetable oil, where is that going?
Most is going into food manufacturing.
And is that just general palm oil, or is it like, is there a way to turn that into a really Franken fat by hydrogenating or anything like that? Is that how it's used, or how is that used in food manufacturing? And does that make it good or bad?
Yeah. So food manufacturing, what we're talking about here is like Mars bars or something like that. They want to use a stable fat in their candy bar, and traditionally they'd use trans fats, partially hydrogenated soy oil. More companies are using palm oil because it's very high in saturated fat. So it sort of acts like a trans fat from a physical property standpoint. So the whole reason trans fats were created were to create, you have something that's oily like soybean oil, and you can create something that can just is the consistency of margarine, essentially.
Stability. So like that's a huge reason. Like we're moving to food products now, and it's been really challenging because we creating things that are stable, that are fat, high healthy fat is like really, really challenging.
Yeah. And so palm oil is a much easier way to get there for food manufacturers because so after the palm is processed, you have crude palm oil, which is the red stuff, the red palm oil, very high in vitamin E. You can buy it on Amazon. It's available at health food stores. Very healthy stuff. That is then refined. So the coloring is removed, and then it can be separated into a more saturated fat product and a product higher in unsaturated fats, monounsaturated primarily. And so a lot of these food manufacturers are using that saturated part of the separation as sort of a replacement for a trans fat, which, fine, that's great, but you still have all these sustainability and ethical issues of unsustainable palm.
But from a health standpoint, that 30% of palm oil being used worldwide, is that a good move overall?
From a health standpoint, I think so. Yeah, if we're looking at just of the silo of health, probably. If it replaces a trans fat, absolutely.
Yeah, and then obviously if it replaced soybean oil, that would be good.
That would be good. Yeah, I mean, you run into issues of if they're partially hydrogenating palm oil,
right?
But there's not as much of a need to do that. Still, for some, they might, but not as much of a need.
Okay. So the sustainable version.
Yeah, so the sustainable version. And I mean, switching to palm in general, but especially unsustainable palm, and especially, whether it's algae oil or coconut oil or whatever, by using more of the good stuff, that inherently means you're using less of the bad stuff. And as we talked about, 90% of soybeans are pressed for oil. So if we're using less vegetable oil, that means that there's less of a need for all of these monocrops. And so you asked about what would happen worldwide if we if we replaced all vegetable oil. Way fewer monocrops, prices would probably go up. Farmers would start looking for alternatives. They'd put their cows on grass instead of this expensive corn and soy. So there'd be huge downstream effects. Just wanted to get that in there. So on sustainable palm, so we work at our restaurant. We work with a company called Palm Done Right, and I don't have any affiliation to this company. I just absolutely love them. PalmDoneRight.com. You can see all the details. So they started with the idea that palm doesn't have to be unsustainable. Palm is an absolutely incredible oil for cooking and for sustainability. For most crops, let's say like a soy, you grow it one season and then you kind of have to start over the next. And every season the soil gets a little more depleted and you're using more chemical fertilizers and all that. A palm tree is around for decades and decades. And the only thing that changes is you have to keep going higher up on the palm tree in order to get the palm fruit. So once it's harvested, 8 feet off the ground and you cut that off and harvest the palm fruit, the next one grows at 8.5 feet off the ground, then 9 feet. And so as you keep going, it just keeps going higher up. But you're not having to replace it with completely new plants. Maybe every 40 years or something when it's just so high up, it's getting ridiculous to harvest. So that's one thing. So this company did that, and they started with small farms in Ecuador and in parts of Africa. Palm grows only within a very specific region close to the equator. So that's why it's so prevalent in Malaysia, Indonesia, and South America and Africa. So So this company, Natural Habitats, the organization's called Palm Done Right. I went to their farm in Ecuador to learn all about how you can grow palm for good. And so they have these huge areas of land. They're working with farmers, and they're getting farmers that have been growing palm in the traditional, unsustainable way, and they're converting them over to grow it in a more sustainable way. So what does that mean? They are building up degraded land. They're, instead of having these huge, even palm could be a monocrop in some ways. They're working with farmers. Some of these farmers only have a few hectares of land. Others have more, but nothing near the size of the huge plantations in Southeast Asia. And they're paying the farmers more. They're paying them more to follow organic, sustainable practices. And those palm farmers are doing the right thing. So there's no child labor. They have the equivalent of Social Security. There are random audits by Natural Habitats to make sure that they're following practices. There are workshops. There's education. I visited a few of the farms there in Ecuador, and it's exactly what you'd want to see in a sustainable system. We were going through the palm farm, and there's grasses growing in between the trees. There's cattle that's grazing on the grass in between the trees. There's pineapple also growing on that same farm. It's a system that works, and I think this is the type of system that could hold the answer for a lot of these issues. Palm is also, this is on Palm Done Right's website. It's something like 37 times more productive than soy in terms of how much oil you can extract per hectare of land. There are huge advantages to using palm. It's more heat stable, higher smoke point, healthier fatty acid profile, low in omega-6 inflammatory fats. So yeah, there's a way to do palm right, and this is just one organization that's doing it.
Didn't you say like they're powering a lot of their factories that press the palm on the palm?
Yeah, this is really great. And again, there are photos of this on the blog post, which will be in the show notes. So everything, it's like a pretty close to a closed loop system. So once a week, maybe twice a week, farmers from the area will drive a truck in and drop off all of their palm. And then in the late morning, the processing plant will process all this palm from start to finish. And at the end of it, they've pressed all the oil, and now they have these palm shells or husks, the dried part of the palm that wasn't pressed for oil. Some of that will go toward feeding animals, but the majority actually goes toward powering the plant. So they'll burn it for steam to power the plant. They'll put it in huge holes in the ground, essentially, that ferments, that then they can do a lot of other things with. All the excess water they feed the surrounding rainforest with. Nothing goes to waste there.
It's incredible. Yeah. And so just to break down the palm myth, one, it's not inflammatory or unhealthy.
True.
Two, there are good ways to actually do it that solve a lot of the problems with current vegetable oil production.
Yep. And there are certifications that you can look for. I'm blanking on the name off the top of my head, but there are a couple of different certifications for how the palm is created. And if you're buying a candy bar that has palm in it, you're guaranteed pretty much to not be done the right way.
Right.
But look for certifications on the palm oil you buy. Red palm oil is an excellent choice. And then, that's just one oil that we use in our restaurant, but olive oil, avocado, butter, ghee, lard, coconut oil, macadamia oil, these are all awesome choices as well.
So one of the things with the keto diet too is like, especially when it comes to MCT oil and MCT oil powder, people freak out if stuff is palm versus coconut. And so I think that as we scale, we're going to be switching over a lot of stuff to palm actually. And not just, it's a big marketing thing on MCT oils and stuff like this is like made with 100% coconut. Mm-hmm. So nutritionally it does not matter actually. And it can, if we support, so we actually support, so we're looking at locking down a lot of supply from these places that have these certifications that are super sustainable, can actually be a good thing for the environment and not a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these farmers they're not expanding their lands, these sustainable farmers. This organization is converting unsustainable palm to sustainable palm farmers.
So it's actually a good thing.
I would think so, yeah.
Right. And so Whereas when people say 100% coconuts, like there can be really shitty coconut farms as well. Like probably not as bad for the environment as palm can be, but in general, like if it's coconut, you have no guarantee that it's been done in the right way.
Yeah, coconut hasn't gotten nearly the attention. I actually don't know too much about how coconut is harvested and the sustainability, but because palm has gotten so much attention on the negative side, it means that the people who are doing it right have to do it perfectly in order to be the juxtaposition to those who are doing it incorrectly, for example. And so if they have these certifications, if they're doing it right, you can feel really good about using MCTs, about using oil from that product.
Yeah. So when looking at one more thing I want to touch on is, okay, we talked about modifications you can get at home, oils you can choose. You just rattle off a long list of really good stuff. We talked about the modifications you can make while eating out, what you should ask for, what you should avoid. As far as if people are going to eat packaged foods, I'm not a huge fan of it, but a lot of times I'll look at something and be on the go and be like, oh, sweet, this thing is like, could be keto friendly. And then I look at it and it's like filled with vegetable oils. What are the main things there that people should look at? Whether that be soybean oil, obviously we chatted about in depth, but are there any that are okay or not as bad? Like should people be worried about sunflower oil? Does this fall into that camp, or is it kind of an in-betweener? What are your thoughts on packaged food oils?
Yeah. So you're very, very rarely, except maybe with Primal Kitchen using avocado oil, Perfect Keto items using coconut butter, coconut oil, you're basically not going to see packaged food items that are using macadamia nut oil or avocado oil or organic coconut oil or things like that. But there are a few things you can look for that are helpful. And especially if you're traveling, some of these can be lifesavers when you're in South America, for example, where I was just visiting the palm farms there. So just to be very clear on the nose, run for the hills when you see these oils on a packaged food. Vegetable oil, soybean oil, peanut oil, rice bran oil, canola oil, cottonseed oil, corn oil, sunflower oil. Unfortunately, it sounds natural, but that's actually one of the highest omega-6 contents is from sunflower oil. Safflower oil. I don't know what a safflower is, but I'm going to avoid that.
So I was thinking about when we were talking about palm oil, how you said that they renamed, or vegetable oil is convenient, and canola is like, what is a canola? What is a safflower? I think it sounds nice though.
Sounds very nice.
Should we do a campaign to rename sustainable palm oil to like rainbow oil or something like that?
I think we should.
Or like golden oil or something?
Yeah, I like that. And it would probably work if history is any example.
Okay, so sunflower and safflower, same toxic bullshit you're going to get from all those other places.
Yeah, the last one on the list is grapeseed oil. Yeah. Avoid that. And so with something like a grapeseed oil, a sunflower oil, walnut oil, a drop or two, like sesame oil, not a big deal. A drop or two of sesame oil makes something really delicious, and a drop is going to have like zero impact on all this stuff we've talked about. Also with those oils, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a few sunflowers or a few walnuts or a few sesame seeds. There are none of the toxins present that there are in soy and wheat germ oil and corn and peanuts and things like that. So those aren't quite as bad, but they actually have a much higher omega-6 ratio. So when you're looking at the healthy fats, like macadamia nut oil is 1% polyunsaturated. Polyunsaturated is what we want to avoid. Coconut oil is 2%. Butter is 4%. Palm oil is 10%. Avocado is 14%. But then when you look at something like a sunflower or safflower oil, it's 70 to 80% polyunsaturated fats. These are the very unstable ones that go rancid, that, they're left in your kitchen. Your kitchen's a little warm, or it's in a little bit of direct sunlight, and boom, it's rancid, let alone being in a deep fryer. So little tip though, for when you're, whether you're traveling or whether you're in the US looking at packaged foods, something that's a decent compromise would be a high oleic sunflower oil. And this is becoming a little bit more prevalent because it has some culinary benefits and that it's more stable. So high oleic sunflower oil is essentially sunflower oil that has much more monounsaturated fat. So the high oleic comes from the primary fatty acid in olive oil, oleic acid. And so that's where they got the name high oleic acid. And they're doing it with sunflower oil. They're doing it with some soybean oil. You still have the issue of the toxins in soy coming through the oil and supporting a monocrop. But I think high oleic sunflower oil as like a tier 2 is actually not a bad option.
Okay. How is that done? Is that done through a process of, again, like ultra processed manufacturing and solvents and all of this stuff of like, yeah, we're getting, it's not as bad, but we're still so far removed from a real thing that it's like we've had to go through 1,500 steps to get to a high oleic version, to which we just like, obviously it's probably one of these things of like better than, but still probably if you can avoid and control that, it's probably a smart move to do so. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's like?
Yeah, I agree. I think, there are tiers for all of this. Yeah. If there are people who are malnourished, lacking calories and are on the verge of death, then I don't care whether we could be feeding them isolated gluten mixed with soybean oil and a high sugar diet, and it's going to be better than the alternative, which is nothing and, potential mortality. But when we're looking at a healthy person, if you're looking at most of America, probably an overweight person who's trying to decide what they should eat, definitely do not think of high oleic sunflower oil as a health food that will, help you reach your health goals. But if you are, you need a snack, you can fast, obviously. But if you need a snack and you see that high oleic sunflower oil is an option, definitely don't feel as bad as if you're eating something with vegetable oil or soybean oil. So to create that the high oleic sunflower oil, they genetically modify sunflowers that will create seeds that are higher in monounsaturated fat.
Got it.
So that's why I put it on sort of a tier 2, not the tier 1 of all the healthful fats I mentioned.
Interesting. So look at packaging when you do this stuff. Like you'll be surprised even as like, oh, nuts are great. Nuts are healthy for me. And then you flip it over and there's like 4 different vegetable oils that the nuts are roasted in.
Yeah. And I find it hilarious. You've probably seen this a lot, where it says something like sunflower and or safflower oil. Right. Like they've lost track of the crap they're even putting in there.
Right. It's just a giant vat, and they just with the deep fryer, they top it off with whatever they need to, which is like, I don't know how they can get away with that, but yeah, I don't know. Okay. Was that an hour and a half long chat on oils? I think we still have a lot of stuff that we'd want to unpack that we haven't gotten to. So maybe for another time. So obviously you have Kitava in San Francisco, if you want to chat about that or any other things that you're working on where people can find you.
Yeah. Well, it's been awesome chatting about this. Most people aren't as interested as you are to hear about my rants on vegetable oils.
It's just funny because this is like a very surface level conversation of what, like we're at dinner and then 2 hours later go by and like we have these conversations on pretty much a nightly basis.
We need to start recording them.
Yeah, and solutions on how we think that we should be able to fix this. So coming soon, perhaps. But yeah, this is actually not an uncommon occurrence for us. So I'm glad we actually got one on the recorder.
Yeah, me too. So everything we've talked about, I put my blood, sweat, and tears into a restaurant that I co-own in San Francisco called Kitava. So we cook with palm oil. We use all pasture-raised meats. Love for people to check that out. They took over an old McDonald's in Mission. Yeah, the irony is not lost on us there. We still have. So the McDonald's had a huge freezer because nothing was fresh, and a little teeny fridge. And so we actually swapped those, and now their huge freezer is now our huge fridge. And their little teeny fridge is now our little teeny freezer.
You just change the temperature, or what did you do?
Yeah, we got some mechanics in there to tweak some stuff. It was a McDonald's. Now is a paleo-friendly, keto-friendly option in San Francisco. And as I've been working on all this stuff, I found that it was very difficult to figure out what foods had what nutrients. And so another little project I'm working on is called Trish. It's at trish.io. And it's a way that you can plan an elimination diet. You can find, let's say, what oils are low in omega-6 that for someone who has a nut allergy, you can do a deep dive into nutrition. So this isn't launched yet, but another little side project I'm working on. Yeah,
so I think we should probably just do an entire episode about micronutrient contents and different types of food. We were at a giant villa on one of the islands here last week, and I was just like grilling Jeff over and over, like, Jeff, hit me with kiwi. What are the stats? Like, we pulled up this like really crazy spreadsheets of all of these different things, like food compared to different foods and what's more nutrient dense versus not. Just stuff that I think generally has not been done. And if it hasn't been put into usable form. And so maybe someone makes a chart and puts it on a blog. Okay, well, unless someone's on that blog that they don't know. It's like some of this stuff is very, very interesting. So a fun fact on that, I learned that kiwis are pretty much the most nutrient-dense fruits with the most nutrients per gram of fructose sugar, correct?
That's spot on, yeah. They have more vitamin C than an orange, more potassium than a banana.
Right. Fun facts. Left and right. It's amazing. So yeah, I think that, I don't know when you guys are going to launch that, but I think that that's fascinating to chat about. Chatting about how you chose the meats and everything you learned from sourcing stuff for Kitava, I think is an interesting conversation. So we'll probably do around 2, 3, 4, 5.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.